The Iraqi colonel had heard the Americans were coming. He had heard the Saudis, the French, even the Italians. What he had not expected on the freezing desert night of January 17th, 1991, was the sound that now tore January 1991, was the sound that now tore across the runway at Talil, a low, flat, ripping thunder that seemed to come from beneath the horizon itself. He stepped out of the command bunker just in time to see the shape pass overhead. Not high, not distant. 40 meters, perhaps 50, above the concrete. A swept-wing silhouette against the muzzle flash of his own anti-aircraft batteries, gone before the gunners could traverse. Then a second. Then a third. Behind them, the runway erupted. He would later write, in an after-action report that British intelligence officers, sifting through captured Iraqi documents at Safwan a few weeks afterwards, would read with quiet fascination that he had never seen aircraft flown like that. Not the Iranians during 8 years of war. Not the Israelis in 1981. Whoever these pilots were, the colonel concluded, they were either suicidal or possessed of a discipline he could not fathom. They flew, he wrote, as though the ground were not a danger, but a friend. They were British. They flew Panavia, Tornado, GR, one-strike aircraft, the cutting edge of RAF Strike Command, designed at Warton in Lancashire for precisely this purpose, to penetrate Warsaw-packed airfields at hedge height, scatter their runways with submunitions, and survive the journey home. Now, in the opening hours of Operation Granby, they were doing it for real, against the densest air defense network ever constructed outside Europe. Within 10 days, 6 of them would be lost. 2 of their crews would appear on Iraqi television, bruised and broken, reading statements written for them by their captors. The British press would howl. The War Cabinet under John Major, barely 2 months in office, would face its first true military crisis. And in the bunkers of Baghdad, Iraqi commanders would begin compiling the documents that, decades later, would tell us something extraordinary: what the enemy actually thought of the men in the cockpit. This is the story Whitehall told one way, and Baghdad told another. The official RAF history records bravery and adaptation. The Iraqi after-action papers, some captured at the time, others released to Western researchers in the years after 2003, record something more uncomfortable and more interesting. They record a generation of British pilots who flew tactics their own commanders later admitted were on the ragged edge of survivability. They record an enemy that learnt, very quickly, to respect a small force in grey desert camouflage whose roundels they had not expected to see in their skies. How did the Royal Air Force end up there? 3,000 miles from RAF Bruggen and RAF Marham, hammering Iraqi airfields at 50 feet in the dark. Why did Sir Patrick Hine, the British Joint Commander, authorize tactics that horrified some American planners watching from Riyadh? And what, precisely, did the Iraqi colonels write when the smoke cleared and they sat down to explain to their superiors how a service that had not fought a major war since Korea had carved their air force open in a fortnight? To understand any of it, we have to go back. Not to August 1990, when Saddam Hussein's tanks crossed into Kuwait. Not even to Margaret Thatcher's last great act in Aspen, telling the new American president he must not go wobbly. We have to go back further, to a quiet decision taken in a cabinet office room in the late 1970s about an aeroplane that did not yet exist. The Tornado was a child of the Cold War's most paranoid decade. In the mid-1970s, the Joint Intelligence Committee in Whitehall had been receiving alarming assessments of Soviet air power in Central Europe. The Warsaw Pact possessed a numerical advantage in tactical aircraft so vast that the only realistic NATO response was to destroy them on the ground in the first hours of any conflict. The RAF's existing Buccaneers and Jaguars could deliver iron bombs at low level, but neither aircraft had been designed from scratch for the airfield denial mission. Britain needed something new. So, for that matter, did West Germany and Italy. The result was the multi-role combat aircraft, eventually christened Tornado, a tri-national program that the British Aircraft Corporation, MBB, and Air Italia delivered against every prediction of disaster. By the early 1980s, Tornado GR1s were entering service at RAF Cottesmore and RAF Honington. By the end of the decade, they formed the backbone of RAF Germany at Bruggen, Laarbruch, and Wildenrath, training every working day for a war they all hoped never to fight. A NATO interdiction campaign east of the inner German border, conducted at no more than 200 feet above the deck. The doctrine that grew up around this aircraft was unsentimental, low level, fast, in pairs or fours, ingressing beneath the radar horizon, attacking with the JP-233 submunition dispenser, a long pod slung beneath the fuselage that scattered runway cratering bomblets and HB-876 area denial mines across an enemy airfield in a single, terrifying pass. To use it, the aircraft had to fly straight and level over the runway at perhaps 180 feet, releasing its load over a span of seconds. Crews trained for this in Wales, in Scotland, in the deserts of Goose Bay, in Labrador, and over the broken country of Bavaria. They knew, in the cold language of operational analysis, that in a European war, the JP-233 mission would carry attrition rates that the air staff politely described as significant. This was the force John Major inherited when, in late November 1990, he became Prime Minister upon Mrs. Thatcher's defenestration. Whitehall was already on a war footing in everything but name. The Iraqi invasion of Kuwait on August 2nd had detonated a diplomatic and military mobilization unprecedented since the Falklands. Thatcher, in her last great foreign policy act, had stood beside George Bush at Aspen and told the president, in the now famous phrase, that this was no time to go wobbly. Britain would commit. The Foreign Office, under Douglas Hurd, had worked the United Nations relentlessly. The Chiefs of Staff, under Marshal of the Royal Air Force, Sir David Craig, had begun shipping the 1st Armoured Division and a substantial RAF deployment to the Gulf. The British public, by January, was uneasy but resolved. Memories of the Falklands 10 years earlier hovered behind every news bulletin. The newspapers, the Times, the Telegraph, the Mail, had largely fallen in behind the government. The Labour opposition, under Neil Kinnock, after some agonising, had supported the deployment. The Liberal Democrats had wavered. CND had marched. And in operations rooms at High Wycombe, the RAF Joint Commander, Air Chief Marshal Sir Patrick Hine, had begun choreographing what would become the largest British air deployment since 1945. Out in Bahrain and Tabuk and Muharraq, the squadrons were arriving. Number 14, Squadron from Bruggen. Number 17, Number 31, Number 9, Number 27 Squadron, Number 15 from Laarbruch, detachments from 16 and 20. They flew their Tornadoes south in long ferried legs over France and the Mediterranean, each aircraft trailing a Victor or VC-10 tanker. The sand and pink desert camouflage was sprayed on in theatre, often hurriedly. The crews had trained for the North German plain. They were about to find out whether the doctrine travelled. The man who would have to make the doctrine travel was Air Vice Marshal Bill Ratton, the senior RAF commander in theatre, working under Sir Patrick Hine at High Wycombe and answerable, through the chain of command, to the War Cabinet in Downing Street. Ratton was a former Lightning pilot, sharp, precise, not given to either bombast or panic. His American opposite number was Lieutenant General Chuck Horner, the coalition air component commander whose black hole planning cell in Riyadh was at that moment assembling the air tasking order that would orchestrate 3,000 sorties a day. The Americans were uneasy about the British plan. They could see what the RAF intended: a sustained low-level campaign against Iraqi forward operating bases, using JP-233 to crater the runways and prevent the Iraqi Air Force from generating sorties. Horner's planners understood the logic. They had nothing comparable to JP-233 in their own inventory. But the tactic in the Iraqi environment looked dangerous in a way that worried them. The Iraqi airfields were enormous. Saddam had built them with surplus oil revenue in the 1980s, copying Soviet templates with multiple parallel runways and dispersed hardened aircraft shelters. They were ringed with ZSU 23-4 Shilkas, SA-13S, SA-8S, and a forest of optically aimed anti-aircraft artillery. Flying straight and level above one at 200 feet, even in the dark, would be like wading into a beehive with a torch. But the RAF had trained for nothing else. The JP-233 only worked from low level. The Tornado's strength was low level. The crews had spent careers learning to fly at heights where the desk-bound called for prayers. And, crucially, there was a strategic case. Iraq possessed roughly 700 combat aircraft, including French-built Mirage F-1s and Soviet MiG-29s. If they were allowed to generate sorties, even ineffectively, they could disrupt the coalition's air superiority campaign and complicate the eventual ground offensive. Shut the airfields, and you shut the war's most unpredictable variable. In the British squadrons, the mood through December and into January was a strange mixture of exhilaration and dread. Many of the aircrew were in their 20s and early 30s. Some were Cold War veterans who had spent their adult lives anticipating the moment Soviet armor rolled across the Fulda Gap. Others were younger, drawn from the great wave of recruitment in the 1980s when defense spending under Thatcher had peaked. They knew what their American counterparts did not always know, that the British government, having committed, would not pull them out. There would be no half-war. On January 16th, the air tasking order for the opening night was distributed. Number 15, squadron from Bahrain would attack Shaiba and Talil. Number 27, deployed to Muharraq, would go after Al-Assad. Number 14 and others from Tabuk would strike H2 and H3, the great airfields in Iraq's far west. Each formation would consist of 4 tornadoes, typically with 2 carrying JP-233 and 2 carrying 1,000-pound bombs to suppress the defenses. They would be escorted by American F-15S for top cover and supported by coalition jamming aircraft. They would attack in pitch darkness, navigating by terrain-following radar. Meanwhile, in Baghdad, Saddam's air defense commanders were preparing too. Iraqi after-action reports recovered later make clear that they expected the air war. They expected American stealth aircraft, which they admitted, with rueful honesty, they could not see and could not engage. They expected cruise missiles. What they had not entirely worked out was how the British force, which they understood to be present in significant numbers, intended to fight. The assumption in some Iraqi sector commands, captured in the documents, was that the British would behave like the Americans: high level, standoff weapons, electronic warfare envelopes. They were about to be corrected. At 02:38 hours local time, on January 17, 1991, the first wave of RAF tornadoes crossed into Iraqi airspace. The cockpit voice recordings, where they survive, are remarkable for their flatness. Crews on a job, calling height, fuel, threat warnings. Beneath them, the desert flickered with sporadic gunfire. Above them, somewhere unseen, American F-15Cs from Tabuk swept for any Iraqi fighter desperate enough to take off. The first attacks went in successfully. JP-233 pods opened, scattering their submunitions in long ribbons across Iraqi runways. The Iraqis were stunned. The Talil after-action narrative, reconstructed from documents captured after the ceasefire and later studied at Cranfield's Defense Studies Department, described aircraft passing so low that the air pressure shook our equipment in the shelters. One Iraqi officer recorded that he initially thought helicopters were attacking because no fixed-wing combat aircraft had ever flown that low over his base. Only when the runway lit up with submunition strikes did he understand. But the second night was worse. The Iraqis had begun to learn. Anti-aircraft gunners, instead of trying to track the tornadoes as they ingressed, simply put up walls of fire above the runway centerline and waited. On the night of January 17th to 18th, a tornado from XV Squadron, flown by Flight Lieutenants John Peters and John Nichol, was hit on its run-in to a target near Shaiba. The aircraft burst into flames. Peters and Nichol ejected and were captured within hours by Iraqi militia. 2 nights later, more crews were lost. The pattern was forming. By the end of the first week, the RAF had lost 5 tornadoes. A 6th would follow shortly afterwards. The arithmetic was brutal. Out of roughly 40 deployed strike tornadoes, the force had taken a substantial loss in 7 days. At that rate, sustained operations would have consumed the entire deployment within a month. Then came the moment that shifted the political ground in Britain. On January 20th, Iraqi state television broadcast footage of Peters and Nichol. Peters's face, bruised and swollen, his eyes barely able to focus on the camera, became the most arresting image of the war for the British public. He stumbled through a hostage-style statement his captors had forced upon him, calling the war wrong. The footage flashed across the BBC's 9 o'clock news and onto the front pages the next morning. In Downing Street, John Major's war cabinet met in something approaching cold fury. Hurd, Tom King at Defence, Sir David Craig as Chief of the Defence Staff. The Cabinet Office briefing room machinery hummed. The public's mood was hardening, but in a way the government had not wanted. Not with bravado, but with dread. Were British pilots being thrown away to crater concrete? Was the JP-233 mission worth it? At High Wycombe, Hine had already made the call. Within days of the second tornado loss, orders went out to the squadrons in theatre. Low-level JP-233 attacks would be suspended pending review. The tornadoes would climb. Medium-level bombing, above the worst of the anti-aircraft fire, would become the new norm. But the RAF was not configured for medium-level precision attack. The aircraft lacked targeting pods. The bombs were unguided. For a few days, in late January, the RAF strike force was effectively stood down while a solution was found. That solution was the Pavespike laser designator pod, hurriedly drawn from Buccaneer squadrons at RAF Lossiemouth. The old Buccaneer crews, men in their 40s, with carrier-trained eyes, were about to go to war alongside their younger tornado colleagues. And in doing so, they would change what the Iraqis saw in their skies. The Buccaneer was supposed to be an honourable retirement. Designed in the 1950s for the Fleet Air Arms strike role against Soviet shipping, the type had served on into the 1980s with the RAF's maritime squadrons in Scotland. By January 1991, most of the surviving airframes belonged to Numbers 12 and 208 squadrons at Lossiemouth. They were old, They were unloved by the procurement establishment, and they happened to be the only RAF aircraft equipped with the Pavespike laser designator pod, the device that could turn an ordinary 1,000-pound bomb into a precision-guided weapon by painting the target with an invisible beam of laser light. Within days of the JP-233 crisis, 12 buccaneers were deployed to Muharraq. Their crews were greybeards by combat aviation standards, squadron leaders and wing commanders who had been flying when the Tornado pilots were at prep school. They would not drop bombs themselves. Their job was to fly behind the Tornado strike formations, designate the targets with their Pavespikes, and let the younger crews drop their laser-guided weapons from medium altitude. The pairing, Tornado bomber and Buccaneer designator, became known unofficially in the messes as the Buck and Tonk partnership. The first such mission flew in early February 1991. Target, a road bridge over the Euphrates. From around 18,000 feet, well above the Iraqi medium-caliber anti-aircraft envelope, the Tornadoes released their Paveway 2 bombs. The Buccaneers, holding off at angle, lit the bridge with their laser. The bombs guided in. The bridge dropped into the river. It was, in the words of one ground crew chief, later interviewed by the RAF historical branch, the moment we stopped being a war story and started being a victory story. Over the following 4 weeks, RAF Tornado Buccaneer pairs systematically dismembered the Iraqi strategic infrastructure, bridges, hardened aircraft shelters, communications nodes, ammunition dumps. Later in the campaign, the new TIALD pod, Thermal Imaging Airborne Laser Designator, developed in haste by GEC Marconi at Edinburgh, entered service on the Tornadoes themselves, allowing them to self-designate. 2 TIALD pods arrived in theatre in late February. They flew within days. They worked. The Iraqi response, recorded in their internal reporting, was bewilderment shading into despair. One captured report, drafted by an Iraqi engineer officer at a divisional headquarters near Basra, described the destruction of a hardened aircraft shelter by what he called a single missile striking exactly upon the personnel door. It was not a missile. It was a 2,000-pound Paveway, laser-guided to within a meter of its aim point. Iraqi commanders began ordering their aircraft out of the shelters and dispersed onto open desert, on the theory that they would survive better in the open. Some flew to Iran, where they were promptly impounded. The shelter-busting campaign effectively destroyed the Iraqi Air Force as a combat-effective force before the ground war began. What the Iraqis wrote about the British changed in this period. Earlier reports had emphasized the audacity and recklessness of the low-level Tornado pilots, characteristics they noted with a mixture of admiration and bafflement. Now the reports emphasized something different: precision. A Republican Guard logistics officer's after-action note, captured later, observed that British aircraft do not waste bombs. Where the Americans, with their vast munition stocks, would saturate a target, the British seemed to use a single weapon per aim point and achieve the desired effect. He attributed this, incorrectly but tellingly, to professional discipline of long tradition. It was, in fact, partly necessity. The RAF's stock of laser-guided bombs was smaller. There were no second bombs to spare. Every release had to count, and mostly it did. The bill was paid in human terms before it could be paid in any other. Of the 6 Tornadoes lost on operations over Iraq and Kuwait, most of the crews ejected. Not all survived. Squadron leader Gary Lennox and Flight Lieutenant Kevin Weeks of 15 Squadron were both killed on January 17th when their aircraft, an early British loss of the war, came down near an Iraqi target. Flight Lieutenant Max Collier of 27th Squadron was killed when his Tornado was lost a few nights later. Their bodies were eventually repatriated and their names entered the Roll of Honor at RAF Marham and Bruggen. The captured aircrew, Peters, Nichol, Flight Lieutenant Robbie Stewart, Squadron Leader Dave Waddington, and others, endured weeks of beatings, mock executions, and interrogation in Baghdad's notorious detention centers. Stewart, badly injured on ejection, was treated with a callousness that would later horrify British medical officers who examined him. Peters and Nichol, whose television appearance had become the war's most iconic image of British suffering, were finally released in early March 1991, walking onto an RAF C-10 in a moment captured by 100 cameras. Their book, Tornado Down, published the following year, became the defining popular account of the air war from the British perspective. The political cost in Britain was, paradoxically, limited. John Major's government had feared that the early losses, combined with the television footage of captured aircrew, would erode public support. The opposite happened. The British public, watching the news at 6 and 10 each night, had identified with the young men in the cockpits. Their suffering, far from undermining the war effort, hardened resolve. Major's poll ratings climbed. The 1991 Gulf operation became, alongside the Falklands, one of the two military campaigns that defined late 20th century British political memory. Within the RAF and the Ministry of Defence, however, the post-war inquest was searching. The Defence Operational Analysis Centre produced a series of classified studies, some of which have since been released to the National Archives at Kew. The conclusions were uncomfortable. The JP-233 mission, the studies found, had achieved less than expected against Iraqi airfields. The submunitions cratered the runways effectively for a few hours, but Iraqi engineering battalions, well drilled by the Iran-Iraq War, repaired the damage within a day. Meanwhile, the cost of delivering the weapon, 6 aircraft, multiple aircrew killed or captured, had been disproportionate. The Air Staff conclusion, recorded in a paper to the Chiefs of Staff later in 1991, was blunt. Low-level airfield denial as a doctrine had reached the end of its useful life. The era of medium-level precision attack had arrived. JP-233 itself was quietly withdrawn from service in the late 1990s under the Strategic Defence Review undertaken by George Robertson in the Blair government. The Ottawa Treaty banning anti-personnel mines, which the submunitions contravened, gave the technical excuse for a decision that had been made operationally 7 years earlier. The Tornado fleet was reconfigured for medium-level precision attack with TIALD, Paveway, and later Storm Shadow. The Iraqi cost was different in scale and character. The Iraqi Air Force, the largest in the Arab world before January 1991, ceased to function within 3 weeks. Of approximately 700 combat aircraft, more than 100 had fled to Iran. Several dozen had been destroyed in their shelters, and the remainder were grounded by a combination of damaged runways, destroyed maintenance facilities, and complete loss of command and control. When the ground war began on February 24th, Iraqi pilots simply did not fly. The skies above the battlefield were British, American, French, Saudi, anything but Iraqi. The British learnt. The Iraqis, watching, learnt too. And the documents they wrote would tell a story Whitehall took years to fully read. The immediate aftermath of Operation Granby reshaped British defence policy in ways that would echo for decades. The Strategic Defence Review of 1998 cited the Gulf experience repeatedly. The Tornado force was modernised. The Buccaneers, having flown their last operational missions of any war, were retired in 1994. The procurement of precision weapons, Paveway 2, 3, and 4, accelerated. The Royal Air Force entered the late 1990s as a precision strike force configured for medium altitude operations against pinpoint targets, a transformation directly traceable to the lessons of January and February 1991. The special relationship survived the war stronger than it had entered it. John Major's quieter, more emollient relationship with George Bush worked against many expectations almost as effectively as Thatcher's had. Britain's contribution, the 1st Armoured Division under Major General Rupert Smith, the Tornado Force, the Royal Navy contingent in the Gulf, had been sufficient in scale to give Britain genuine influence in coalition planning without being so large as to risk overstretch. American senior commanders, including Norman Schwarzkopf himself in his memoirs, paid sustained tribute to the British contribution. Schwarzkopf reserved particular praise for the RAF Tornado crews, whom he described as having undertaken some of the most dangerous missions of the air campaign. The Iraqi after-action documents began to surface in Western scholarship slowly. Some were captured in 1991 itself, in the chaos of the coalition advance into southern Iraq, and brought back for analysis at the Defense Intelligence Staff in Whitehall. Many more were uncovered after the 2003 invasion, when much of the Iraqi State Archive fell into coalition hands. The Conflict Records Research Center, established by the United States Department of Defense, made significant tranches of these documents available to scholars. British historians, among them David Reynolds at Cambridge and the late Sir Lawrence Freedman at King's, drew on them for studies of the coalition campaign. What emerged was a picture of an enemy that had taken the British seriously in a way that was not always reciprocated in the West's own self-narration. Iraqi sector commanders had specifically warned Baghdad about the RAF's low-level capability. After the war, in interviews conducted by Western researchers with surviving Iraqi officers, the British contribution was singled out repeatedly for its professionalism and its risk acceptance. One Iraqi general, interviewed years later, told his interlocutor that the British fought as if they had something to prove, a phrase that, in its mixture of admiration and puzzlement, captured something real about a service that had spent 40 years preparing for a war that did not come, and then had 3 weeks to demonstrate it had not been wasted. The special relationship, the Atlantic Alliance, and the broader Western order emerged from the Gulf War in apparent triumph. The Cold War had ended 15 months before Iraqi tanks crossed into Kuwait. Russia, under Mikhail Gorbachev, had voted with the West at the Security Council. China had abstained, but not vetoed. The international system briefly looked as though it might function as the Charter had originally envisaged. For Britain, this was a moment of unusual prominence. The moment of unipolarity, a phrase the American commentator Charles Krauthammer would coin later that year, was also, in its way, a moment of British revalidation. It would not last. By the mid-1990s, the Bosnian Wars would expose the limits of Western intervention. By 2003, the Second Iraq War would shatter the moral confidence of 1991. But in March of that first Gulf year, when the tornadoes came home to Bruggen and Marham, the men in the cockpit returned to a country that had remembered what it felt like to win. What does the story of the British tornado pilots tell us, 3.5 decades on, about Britain's place in the world? It tells us, first, that doctrine has consequences. The Royal Air Force of January 1991 was a force that had spent 40 years preparing to fight a specific war in a specific place, across the inner German border, in the early hours of a Warsaw Pact invasion, at heights that would horrify any civilian pilot. When that war did not come, the doctrine was carried, undigested, to a different theatre against a different enemy in a different climate. It cost lives before it was corrected. The correction itself, the rapid pivot to medium-level precision attack with Pavespike and TIALD, demonstrated that the RAF's deepest virtue is not its hardware, but its capacity to learn under fire. That is a peculiarly British trait, born of 2 world wars and a long imperial tradition of muddling through. It does not always look elegant. It works. It tells us, secondly, that the testimony of one's enemies is often the most honest assessment of one's own performance. The Iraqi after-action documents, patient, technical, sometimes grudging, sometimes admiring, describe a British force whose self-image was not always congruent with its actual effect. The Iraqis admired the courage of the low-level pilots and questioned their wisdom. They admired the precision of the medium-level strikes and could not match them. They wrote, in their own language, about an opponent whose tactics they did not always understand, but whose results they could not deny. There is a humility in reading those documents that ought to inform any history of the campaign written from London. It tells us, thirdly, that the men in the cockpit are always more important than the doctrine on the desk. John Peters and John Nichol, Gary Lennox and Kevin Weeks, Robbie Stewart and Max Collier. These were young officers who flew because they had been told to, and who paid prices that their commanders, in retrospect, came to think too high. Their courage did not absolve the planners. Their courage did, however, illuminate something about Britain that the long ironies of the post-imperial age have not erased. A willingness, when ordered, to go to the most dangerous part of the sky and do the job. That willingness has costs. It also has consequences. The Iraqi Air Force never recovered from what those crews did in January 1991. The strategic outcome of the war, the liberation of Kuwait, the international order's brief moment of confidence, rested in some measurable part on what they accepted in those first nights. The story is not, in the end, a triumphalist one. 6 aircraft lost. Multiple crews killed or captured. A weapon system quietly retired within 7 years. A tactic abandoned. A generation of pilots who came home older than they left. But it is a story that deserves to be told as the Iraqi colonels in their bunkers told it. With respect for what was attempted, regret for what it cost, and an honest reckoning with what it achieved. The enemy, in this case, saw the British more clearly than the British sometimes saw themselves. That is worth pausing over. That is, perhaps, the most British way of remembering a war that the British helped to win. Without parades, without trumpets, with the documents read carefully and the names remembered. If this story moved you, or surprised you, or made you think differently about the men who flew those missions, do let me know in the comments below. Subscribe if you would like more stories from Britain's 20th century wars, told with the same care for the documents and the men who made them, and if you knew someone who served on Granby, a tornado crew, a buccaneer crew, a ground engineer, a mover, a medic, please share their story. They deserve to be remembered.